Okay. Well, good evening, officially. Good evening. We're happy to have you. We welcome you to Winchester Academy's Winter Spring 2022. I'm a little behind. 2022 series. I'm Vanell Van Bentham. I'm Vice President and a trustee of the Winchester Academy Board. So I welcome you on behalf of the Academy. We want to thank up front the City of Waupaca, and in particular, IT and Community Media Director Josh Werner, for making this program possible. He's providing the space and technology so that we can bring this program to you in multiple formats. And so we are able to reach out in ways that we might not have in the past. We will have a Q&A session at the end, as I said. And so we will be able to, again, be having people call in. There is a phone number. If you're calling in with a question at the end of the program, the number is 715-942-9917. So for anyone who is seeing this program at home and would like to call in with a question, 715-942-9917. Before we begin, well, one more thing I'll just say now. Tonight's program was sponsored by the late Joan Wasserberg. Joan served as a trustee of Winchester Academy for many, many years, and together with her husband, Gene, was an enthusiastic supporter of our programming. So we want to thank Joan, if we can just give her a quick applause, and we're just so grateful for that gift. I'm going to kind of give you a couple of upcoming events before we get into our program this evening. First, coming up, the Waupaca Historical Society will be presenting Waupaca's Masonic Lodge this Thursday, March 24th, at the Holly Center at 6 p.m. It's a presentation on the history of the Masonic Lodge in Waupaca. Our next Winchester program is in 1 week. It's on Monday, March 28th, so that's a week from tonight, when Andrea Lemke-Rochon wraps up Women's History Month with her talk, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, a historical and personal perspective. Should be a nice close. Certainly we have a wonderful program this evening for Women's History Month, and then that will be our closing program. One other thing that's coming up for those of you that were here last time when Dr. Aldworth was here, and he was talking about an upcoming seminar called Discussion Group Philosophy for Seniors, and he said he would have out more information as that comes forward. That has been put on the calendar. He's going to be doing that Wednesday morning, April 20th, from 10 to 11:30 a.m., and that's going to be over at St. Mark's Episcopal Church. They've kindly offered him the space in, I believe, probably their lower level conference area. So everyone is welcome, but you do have to be over 60 for that one. So I know it's tough to have to qualify for these things. And then in May, we have Winchester Academy's Roots of Jazz celebration. Something we've really been looking forward to. That's been in the works for so long, in BC, before COVID. And just a lot of people have put in a lot of work. That's going to run from May 2nd to May 9th. And there are free tickets for the ticketed events, but you will need a ticket. They're free. They're available at the bookseller during their regular business hours. So you can check out. There are going to be any number of wonderful things going on. Anita, where are you? Anita in the back will be happy to tell you more about that later if you want to check with her. I know she has some information on that with her. So again, Q&A following the presentation. So let's introduce you. Our speaker tonight is Theresa Kaminski. Theresa, PhD, Professor Emerita of History from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. She's the author of a trilogy of books about American women in the Philippine Islands, including Angels of the Underground. In 2020, Theresa published Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War. And her most recent book, Queen of the West, The Life and Times of Dale Evans, is going to be coming out. She's researched on and off for 10 years, you said? It's been a long time coming, but it'll be released March of 2022. And if any of you were with us when she did the program on Dale Evans, I know you're going to be looking forward to that one coming out, and you can probably check that one out a little bit later. So I think, without further ado, I will offer you Theresa Kaminski. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I'm wired. Is this coming through okay? All right, because I only hear myself in regular tones, so that's good. And if you do hear a cell phone going off, I'll confess it's mine. I have mine on just to watch the time. If somebody does call me, which nobody ever does, except, of course, when I'm in front of an audience. So hopefully, fingers crossed, that won't happen. But I will admit that I'm the one with the phone on, and that's just so I don't go over my time limit. But thank you all for coming out. I know we are still living in slightly strange times, and I know that too because this is my first ever in-person talk about Mary Walker. And the book was released in June of 2020, which I'm sure you all remember was not a good time for going out and doing anything. So I was fortunate enough to do some online events, which were very nice, had a lot of very interested people along the way, but there's really nothing like a personal crowd. So I do appreciate you coming out today. And we do have, you can see the book is up there, and for one lucky member of the audience tonight, there is a free copy for a giveaway, so stay tuned to the end of my talk, and one of you will be leaving here with a free book. But this book took me about a year to research. It was on a fast track. Historians don't normally work that quickly, but it was on the fast track for the Suffrage Centennial. And as it says in the subtitle of the book, The Fight for Women's Rights, Dr. Mary Walker was a big proponent, as I'll talk about in a little while, of the suffrage movement, a very huge advocate for women's rights. So this was timed for the Suffrage Centennial. A lot of those events, too, were canceled in 2020 anyway. So I titled my talk, I Will Always Be Somebody. And this comes from a quote of Mary Walker's much later in her life. She was being interviewed by a newspaper reporter, and this happened to her frequently throughout her life. She was no stranger to reporters, to newspaper coverage. Believe it or not, she was a very well-known woman in her time. In the 19th century, if you said the name Mary Walker, almost everybody would know exactly who you were talking about. And when she was probably in her 70s, she was being interviewed about the fact that she had not remarried. And I'll talk a little bit about her first marriage, but she did spend most of her adult life as a single woman. And the reporter wanted to know why she didn't get married again. And she said, I would not lose my identity to his, meaning a prospective bridegroom. And she said, I will always be somebody. And when you think about women in the 19th century, this is not the kind of sentiment that you would normally hear expressed by a well-brought-up white middle-class woman. So clearly, Mary Walker was not an average woman. So what I want to talk about then over these next minutes is how she presented herself as this very unusual person for the 19th century, what she did during the Civil War, and what she did in the many decades she had of life following those experiences in the Civil War. And just some basic information. Mary Edwards Walker, she did have a long life. She was born in 1832. She died in 1919. 1919, of course, is also the year that the suffrage amendment had been passed through Congress. It was on its way to the individual states for ratification. So she did live long enough that she pretty much knew that suffrage was going to happen, but she didn't quite make it to that particular finish line. And she was born and she grew up in, I guess it would be north central New York State, in a town called Oswego. And this is a drawing that was done kind of in the midpoint of the 19th century. And I think for our purposes today, we really shouldn't think of Oswego as just this sort of isolated backwater where nothing much happened. What you have to know about the state of New York, especially in the early decades of the 19th century, well through the Civil War, this is a hotbed of a series of reform movements, ranging from religious reform, religious revivalism swept through New York State, especially in these rural areas like Oswego. Oswego was also a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. We all know about the anti-slavery movement. There were a lot of people living in and around Oswego who were ardent abolitionists. Mary Walker's own parents were abolitionists. Their house reportedly was a stop on the Underground Railroad as enslaved people were making their way up to Canada. The Walker house, which was actually a farmhouse, they lived on a farm just outside of town. So when Mary Walker was growing up, this was part of her training from birth. Her parents were reformers. They were what was referred to at the time as free thinkers. They did believe in religion. They did not believe in any one set religion as being superior over another. They believed in an intellectual approach to God and religion. They encouraged their children to experiment with religion, to read about different religions, visit different churches. So all of this was part of her growing up. And one of the things that really stuck with her, and this carries through her entire adult life, one of the reforms that she heard about growing up and that she embraced as a young woman and never gave up during her entire adult life was women's dress reform. Okay. Now, some of you may have heard reference, of course, to the bloomer costume. Okay, and here we see one of the magazine drawings from the mid-1800s. The bloomer costume was named after a woman named Amelia Bloomer, who didn't invent it, because actually if you look at, especially if you look at Native American culture in New York State, a lot of the Oneida women were already wearing costumes like this. So you see it in Native American culture. But there were white women who started to experiment with what they saw as a much more liberating form of fashion for women. And they did think of it in terms of the liberation of physical movement. And, you know, because if you think of the traditional 19th century dress, I'm not wearing it today, of course, but, you know, the long skirts, the big hoops on, well, the hoops that got bigger as the decades went on, but the structured undergarments. There were women as early as probably the 1840s who were arguing that the position of women in society could never change as long as they were physically hampered in their movements by this cumbersome dress. So believe it or not, this bloomer costume was seen as freeing and progressive, and most of it was because of, for women, they were usually called pantaloons. And the fact that a woman could wear something on the bottom half of her body that would make free movement. So even as, say, a teenager, Mary Walker was very interested in this bloomer costume. We do know that by probably the early 1850s, she was actually wearing it out in public. Sources do indicate that even before that, as a child growing up on her parents' farm, she was already doing that because she was expected to do farm chores along with her brother. But as far as like going out in public, certainly by the early 1850s, she was doing this. very controversial. Okay, and we'll come back and talk about that. But that was something she picked up on as a young woman, and she was adamant that dress reform was the core reform necessary for women's equality in society. So for her, everything stemmed from that. Okay, all women's rights stemmed from dress reform. Okay. Now, different women thought of even women's rights differently, but this was her belief. And the other big motivating factor in her childhood, and again, this comes from her parents, who were strong proponents of coeducation, meaning that Alva and Vesta Walker, her parents, believed that boys and girls deserved to have equal education. And they not only believed it, but they practiced it. And they had one son and they had, I think, 3 or 4 daughters. And they expected all of their children to have the same kind of education. And the Walkers believed so strongly in coeducation that they set up on their farm a free school for the area children. And so they taught at the adults taught at the school that they set up, so they taught all the children who came. But once their own children had essentially grown out of the education that they could provide at home, the Walkers then encouraged even their daughters to go away to school, to continue with their education and to go beyond what they could offer them on the farm at home and go elsewhere. And this is exactly what Mary Walker did. When she learned everything that her parents could teach her, she went away not too far from home. She still stayed in the state of New York. She went to a place called, I think it was pronounced Folly, the Folly Seminary. Seminary being a 19th century term for school. It didn't really have a religious connection, but it was just a higher level of education, probably more like high school. Not a college, but more high school. And it was at Folly that Mary Walker prepared for 2 things. One was to prepare to be a school teacher, which, again, in the 19th century, if a woman, especially a white middle-class woman, was looking to make her way in the world, which Mary Walker did expect to do, it would probably be as a school teacher. This was considered to be one of the most reputable occupations for a woman. And it was also considered temporary, though, right? That this was something that a woman did maybe for 2 or 3 years before they got married, okay? And then they stayed at home. But for Mary Walker, she knew that teaching school was actually what she wanted to do for 2 or 3 years, not before she got married, but actually before she went to medical school, okay? One of the other things she learned at home from her father was the practice of medicine. Okay. Her father had a lot of medical textbooks. He was not a doctor, he was a farmer. But as a husband and a father, he did what a lot of people did in the hundreds of years before formal medical schools. You take care of people in your own family. You read books, you learn from other people about treating illnesses and accidents. And again, from home, Mary Walker learned as much as she could from her father's textbooks. And that just sort of whet her appetite for more. She wanted to be a doctor. Okay. So her education at Folly got her teaching credentials. She went off and she taught school for a while until she could save up money to go to medical school. Okay. And you all know then what the next problem she faces is, right? Okay. She is at least as qualified as any other prospective medical student at this time, but she lacks one basic qualification, and that is she is not a man. Okay, So she has to really work hard to find a medical school that will accept her. Okay. And the other sort of attendant problem that she has is that her approach to medicine is what I think probably we would call today homeopathic. Back in the 19th century, it was called eclectic medicine, which meant that treatments were based much more on physical therapy, diet, exercise, natural medicines, those kinds of things. And this was becoming unfashionable. It was coming up against what was known as allopathic medicine, or medicine that was scientifically based. You use surgery, you use medicinal compounds. So she wanted to find a school that would teach her eclectic medicine. And again, she was lucky. She didn't have to go very far away. Syracuse actually, at the beginning of the 1850s, opened up a medical college. It only lasted for about 5 years, but she was accepted there. Syracuse would allow female students. She wasn't the only one. She wasn't the only woman in her medical school class, but still a minority. And she enrolled in 1853. This is actually not Syracuse itself. I couldn't find a surviving picture, but this is one that looked very much like it. You're talking about a single building. She enrolled in 1853, and she had her MD in 1855. And again, this was not unusual. This was not because it was an eclectic and inferior course. Most regular medical schools of all kinds in the 19th century, 2 years. Okay? And it's a combination of classroom and practical. You know, you go out and you shadow a doctor and you work as an intern. And that's exactly what Mary Walker did. She graduated in 1855 near the top of her class. She was one of the best students. The other thing that happened to her at medical school was she did meet the man who became her one and only husband. His name was Albert Miller, and the same year that she graduated from medical school, they got married, and they had a wedding ceremony that was very unusual for the time. She wore her bloomer costume. It was all white, but still, she had a bloomer costume. They left the word obey out of their marriage vows, also very unusual for the time, and she kept her name. She was always Dr. Mary Walker. Occasionally, she would use a hyphenated form of her name, but most of the time just Mary Walker. And she and her husband actually set up a medical practice in the town of Rome in New York. And they practiced separately but together. So they each had their own office and they each had their own patients. And in the fashion of the day, her specialty was women and children. That's who she mostly took care of. The marriage, however, was a resounding failure. Albert Miller shared a lot of her beliefs and then some. And he apparently was expecting more of what we would call an open marriage. And when she found out that he was unfaithful, she was absolutely devastated. And even though he very generously said to her, well, you could do the same thing. I would not feel bad. And she said, no, that's not what marriage is. And she divorced him, okay, which, again, highly unusual. This was a very difficult thing. She started the proceedings about 1860. It took nearly 10 years for the divorce to actually become final. I mean, divorce was serious business back then. Okay. But, of course, we also know what else is coming here, right? When the Civil War started, in 1861, Mary Walker, from a family of abolitionists, it was very clear where her loyalties were. Her loyalties were with the United States of America. Okay? So for her, keeping the Union together was everything. And as soon as she was able, in 1861, she needed to pack up her practice and make sure her patients were all taken care of. And as soon as she was done with that, she got, I'm assuming she took a train from New York to Washington, D.C., came in the fall of 1861, went immediately from the train station to the office of the United States Secretary of War, presented herself to Simon Cameron and said, I want a commission in the United States Army as a surgeon. Okay. And had absolutely no idea why he would refuse her, because she knew, and which was absolutely true, the Army was hurting for medical personnel. Okay? Just about every able-bodied man who had any kind of medical training was being absorbed by the Army, and so she thought, great, here I am, I have an MD, I have actual experience as a physician, I'll go, I will serve my country. And of course, she walks into Cameron's office in her full bloomer costume with, well, she had a proper hat on, a proper lady's hat, and her nice curls. And he absolutely doesn't know what to make of her, except to tell her, no, absolutely not. The United States Army does not commission women. The United States Army does not hire female physicians. There's nothing for you here. Okay. And, you know, you don't say no to Mary Walker. You just don't. So she was not willing to go back to New York. She knew, you know, by the fall of 1861, Washington, D.C. was just overrun with wounded soldiers and civilians. There was a huge medical need in that city, not to mention the fact that, considering the geography of the Confederacy and everything, I mean, the city itself was often in peril. She decided to stay. So she spent some days walking around Washington, simply going into every facility that was designated a hospital, because at this point, the regular hospitals were already just too full, and all sorts of other buildings, including the U.S. Patent Office building, had been converted into hospital space. And it had recently been used by this Rhode Island regiment of soldiers. After they were moved out, then a group from Indiana moved in. And this was where Mary Walker had her first bit of luck. As this regiment from Indiana settled in, its physician, a man by the name of J.N. Green, didn't care that she was a woman. He only cared that he was the only medical person in this hospital. He was the only doctor. The assistant, the physician he had working with him, had literally worked himself to death. He had died from overwork and disease. So Mary Walker came in and said, you know, I'll work for you. And he was fine with it. And this was a man, a doctor in the Army, and he said, fine, I want you here. I know what you can do. And he even agreed to intervene with Army officials so that she could actually get credentials. He appealed to the Surgeon General, said, I want her working here. I want her on my staff. The Surgeon General said the same thing that Cameron had said. We don't have female physicians with the Army, so there's nothing we can do about this. But Dr. Green said he wanted her to stay. She volunteered to stay. No money. She was volunteering her services to the Army. He offered to pay her out of his salary. That's how much he wanted her there. And she said no. She knew he was a married man. He had a family to support. She said, I won't take your money, but I will stay and I will volunteer my services. So from 1861 until 1864, Mary Walker donated her medical skills to the United States Army. And she did this mostly in Washington, D.C. She was in these established hospitals, treating the wounded, dealing with diseases. Smallpox was a big problem at the time. So she was a very familiar figure in Washington, D.C. Toward the end of the year of 1862, she'd been starting to move outward from Washington into areas of Virginia that were gradually being conquered by the United States Army, putting it under the jurisdiction once again. And she tended to show up in places not as a battlefield surgeon. She was not usually in locations where active battles were going on, but usually in the immediate aftermath. She would move in, she would settle in and help treat the wounded soldiers. And one of the places we know she was at a place called Lacey House in Falmouth, Virginia. And this was shortly after the Battle of Fredericksburg. This whole area was just full of soldiers who were sick and dying. And her time there as a field surgeon overlapped with two names that I think most people are very familiar with. And it was really interesting tracing the movements of these three people and realizing that they were all at Lacey House at the same time. And I can't believe that they didn't see each other and didn't know that each other were there, because in fact throughout the war and even after the war, Mary Walker and Clara Barton continued a cordial friendship. They were never like close buddies or anything, but they knew each other, they respected each other. But Clara Barton was at Lacey House tending to the wounded, and even the poet Walt Whitman. And this was actually how Whitman came to his own nursing duties during the Civil War. He had come to Lacey House looking for his brother, who had been reported first killed in action, and then he was supposed to be seriously wounded. And Walt Whitman was out looking for him, first in Washington, then ended up in Virginia, ended up at Lacey House, found his brother, who was miraculously quite well, and only had a superficial wound. But this motivated everything that Whitman saw there at Lacey House, all the medical care. This is what helped inspire him to be a nurse during the rest of the Civil War. And this is where some of his poetry then came from about the war itself. And after being with the Army of the Potomac during much of 1862, Mary Walker then, took the kind of next step, which meant going out even further afield. And during 1863, she ends up with the Army of the Cumberland, and she's in Tennessee shortly after the Battle of Chickamauga. And this is where she comes across General George Thomas. And he observes her in action, treating the wounded, and he is going to become one of her real champions. And this is how Mary Walker gets very close to achieving her goal of getting a commission. She never quite makes it, but she comes very close because men like Thomas observe what she can do. And Thomas was very impressed with how he saw her interacting with the soldiers. He was really impressed with her medical knowledge. One of the things that Mary Walker was known for, and this got to be kind of a big issue with medical treatment during the Civil War. You all know how most war wounds were treated, right, was with amputation, which at the time was considered to be life-saving. And it was really kind of a wondrous thing that somebody could have such a severe wound and survive it at the cost of a limb. Well, as an eclectic medical healer, Mary Walker was not really on board with amputations. And she took a lot of extra time and care with patients to see if there wasn't a way of saving limbs rather than removing them. Now, there's quite a bit of controversy over that, whether saving it at all cost is really worth it in the long run. But the men really appreciated the extra time she took to reevaluate, sometimes to challenge the male doctors who just wanted to go in and amputate. So Thomas observed all of this, and he really appreciated her contributions. And when there was a vacancy in the 52nd Ohio Volunteers, this regiment lost their surgeon. Okay. And General Thomas heard about it. And the 52nd Ohio's Volunteers, they weren't in Ohio at this time. There was a contingent of them in northern Georgia. Okay. They were stationed at a place called Lee and Gordon's Mills. Okay. So they're in Georgia, they're in territory that the United States Army is only very nominally holding on to, and it's essentially their encampment there. Okay. But Thomas finds out that they need a medical doctor there, and he thinks of Mary Walker, and he thinks this is the perfect person. But even he cannot commission her, and he's still blocked from commissioning her. But what he can do, and what he does, is he offers her a contract, a civilian contract with the United States Army to work as a doctor or as a surgeon for the 52nd Ohio. And she accepts. Now, you notice that I also have that and spy up there, okay? Because this is the other service that Mary Walker had in fact been offering to the United States Army, which really is a reflection of how aware she was of the different ways in which gender makes her sometimes invisible. Okay. And she also knew this because she was very well aware, and newspapers covered the stories of women like Rose Greenhow and Belle Boyd, probably two of the most well-known and infamous Confederate spies of the early war years. And in fact, Mary Walker's time, when she originally came into Washington, D.C., it overlapped with Greenhow's arrest. You know, the Pinkertons were in on tracking these women down. That's how much value their intelligence was to the Confederacy. And Mary Walker thought, well, I'm a woman, and I'm a doctor, so if I'm out and about, you know, treating patients, I can hear things. And especially when she's in North Georgia. And one of the things that she was tasked with, you know, once all of the soldiers were taken care of, if she wanted to go out and do medical visits in the countryside, because many of the Georgians hadn't had medical attention in years by that point. And she would ride out on her horse, usually packing weapons on her own, with her medical bag and her dental bag, because she did both. And she was essentially out in Confederate territory, treating civilians, but always listening to what the chatter was about where Confederate forces were. And she brought this information right back to her commanding officer and passed it along. And that's what she wanted to do. And there was suspicion around the area that that's in fact what else the lady doctor was doing. And one day she was coming back from one of her visits to the civilians, and she was stopped by Confederate soldiers who said, yeah, you may be a doctor, but we know what else you're doing out here. and she was taken prisoner. And so for a period of a few months in 1864, Dr. Mary Walker was a prisoner of the Confederacy, and she spent time in Castle Thunder in Richmond, Virginia, which was not a pleasant place to be. She suffered lifelong medical problems, mostly with her eyes as a result of this. Her treatment there and her subsequent health problems were what entitled her to a pension after the war was over. So she did get a little bit of assistance. But when she was freed in a prisoner exchange in 1864, she went right back and asked for another assignment. She ended up working at a Confederate women's prison for a while, and she spent the rest of the war in service to the United States Army as a contract surgeon and earning money. And at the end of the war, she had made such a big impression on so many well-placed officers that, and she was still pushing for a commission, even after the war was over with. She still wanted that commission, sort of as a retroactive recognition of what she had done. So there was the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, worked through the Judge Advocate General, a man by the name of Joseph Holt, to look into this issue of whether or not Mary Walker could be commissioned. And both of those men essentially said, no, we can't commission women in the military, no matter what she had done. And everybody agreed that, you know, above and beyond the call of duty, especially for what a woman did. And so the decision they came to was to give her the Medal of Honor. And this was presented to her by President Andrew Johnson in late 1865. The congressional paperwork was finalized in early 1866. But this was, she never claimed to have been in combat. She never claimed she, put on a soldier's uniform and fought, but she provided medical services. And this was how the United States government chose to honor that work that she did. So she received the Medal of Honor, and you see her wearing the star. And this was, it's hard to call it a consolation prize because we all know what the Medal of Honor means. But to her, it was a little bit, to her, the commission really was what she wanted, but she was very much honored by this medal, and she wore it almost every day for the rest of her life. And she was only 33 years old when the war ended. So she's the only woman to have received the Medal of Honor that still stands today. Okay? So from 1865 to 2022, still the only woman. Okay? So then the question she faces is what to do with the rest of her life. She's 33 years old. Okay? No family except her mother and father and her siblings. She does continue to practice medicine, but really only occasionally. Her own health problems cause some issues, but she practices enough to earn a living. She can keep herself together with that. Her family sends her some money. But mostly she stays in Washington because she wants to work on behalf of women's rights. Okay? This is important to her. And not surprisingly, right? The equal treatment of women under the law, very important to her. And the great cause after the end of the Civil War was the cause of women's suffrage or women's voting rights. And Mary Walker worked with a variety of organizations at the time. And the American Equal Rights Association was the main one coming right after the Civil War, which, as its title implies, actually worked for both gender and racial equal rights and suffrage, meaning that the newly freed population required those kinds of citizenship rights. The Universal Franchise Association that started in Washington, D.C., again, the word franchise synonymous with voting or suffrage. So it's all about voting rights. And Mary Walker worked with and for a time was friends with some of the big names in the suffrage movement. We see there Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the white-haired woman with the little cap on. Of course, Susan B. Anthony, two huge names in the suffrage movement. Slightly less well-known, Belva Lockwood, who was one of the first female attorneys to pass the bar. All of these women working on behalf of women's voting rights in the post-war time period. And Mary Walker adhered to a particular theory about voting rights for women. And it was referred to as the New Departure because it was new in terms of thinking about women's voting rights. And it comes out of the language of the 14th Amendment. Okay? And you can kind of see where women's suffrage advocates might get really excited about the language of this 14th Amendment. Okay? This was one of the post-war amendments designed to protect citizenship for the newly freed population. All persons born or naturalized are citizens. You can't deprive citizens of life, liberty, or property. Equal protection of the laws. And the second section of it goes on then to talk about voting rights. So linking citizenship with voting rights. So in the theory of the New Departure, okay, women then are citizens, right? They're born or naturalized, so they're citizens. So as citizens then, boom, voting rights. It's right there. Okay. What they conveniently kind of ignored was also that phrase that stipulated male inhabitants. But they said, okay, is denied to any of the male inhabitants. So maybe they just didn't say female inhabitants too. So they kind of didn't trouble themselves with that. But everybody else did, okay? But still, Mary Walker latched on to this and said, okay, once the 14th Amendment was passed, the Constitution of the United States already provides for women's voting rights, and nobody should be able to impede that. And there is some evidence that as early as 1867, Mary Walker was attempting to vote herself, to just show up at the polls and vote. And this was one of the strategies that suffragists had. Okay? They would simply go and register and attempt to cast a ballot. Maybe as early as 1867, she tried to do this in Oswego, where she was a landholder, because this was another argument that women made, of course, that there were plenty of women who owned property. And if they owned property, why weren't they voting? Okay, because if they weren't, wasn't that, a little thing called taxation without representation? And wasn't there a whole American Revolution about that? So this was what really captivated Mary Walker about the whole suffrage campaign. However, I always caution against looking for heroes in the past, because you can't really find many of them. And as many positive things as we can say about Mary Walker, we can't forget the fact that she did try to play, today it would be called playing the race card. And when it seemed like women's suffrage might get stalled, and in fact it was delayed because all of the efforts were behind voting rights for black men, Mary Walker started to promote racially based women's suffrage, promoting, and she actually created an organization called the White Women's Franchise Association, and she was the head of it. She created it, and it was all about promoting, and it wasn't quite as blatant as the title sounds. I mean, it was about white women, but the thing that was supposed to soften this was education, that the voting rights would be for educated white women. So these would be the people who should be casting ballots next. But you'll notice it's like a month in 1 year that this organization survived, because what Mary Walker found out was that not too many people were willing to join that organization. And she's going to get credit for any of this, for anything in this. It's that when she realized that this was a big mistake, she stopped. She shut the organization down, never talked about it again. And she continued to work on women's voting rights in these other larger organizations. So she did not continue to harp on that white part of suffrage. And she also went out on the road as a suffrage lecturer. This was the other way she made money in the post-Civil War era, particularly for, she had a set lecture circuit from 1869 to 1870, complete with flyers and everything, a schedule. She did pretty well during these lectures. Again, she earned enough money to keep going. She was essentially paying her way to travel around and to speak on behalf of women's voting rights. And she was willing to go just about anywhere. And in some places she did face hostile crowds. Not everybody wanted to hear what she had to say, and especially because she was still wearing, and notice the fashion does start changing as the years go on. The pantaloons aren't as poofy anymore, and this is starting to look much more like a man's suit, right? It is much more tailored. Even the hat doesn't look as much like a woman's hat anymore. But she, like I said before, she believed that as long as women were hampered by fashion, that they could not be equal to men. And she also was constantly asked, why do you wear men's clothing? Okay. And one of her very famous responses was, I don't wear men's clothing. She said, I'm not a man, okay, I'm a woman. I wear my own clothes. So whatever clothes I wear, they are my own clothes. They're not men's clothes, they're mine. So she totally rejected this notion of gendered clothing. And this actually caused a rift within the mainstream women's suffrage movement, because Mary Walker, to mix time frames, she did not walk softly and carry a big stick. She walked loudly and carried a big stick. She was very vocal about her beliefs. She actually criticized Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the other great suffrage leaders for abandoning the bloomer costume so early on, for giving up, for giving in. And she was very vocal about this. So heading into the 1870s, the main suffrage organization, the National Woman Suffrage Association, she belonged to it, but she was increasingly ostracized at the meetings because of her attire. The other message that she promoted always, divorce reform. And again, it's not that a lot of women's rights advocates didn't agree with her on this, but they thought she was much too loud about it, much too vocal. And apparently at times she would share some of her own personal stories about her first marriage that to some people just sounded too personal. And this is not what you talk about in public. But she was adamant that divorce was something that needed to be addressed by the women's movement. And she became so persona non grata within the mainstream movement that after she joined what then became the National American Woman Suffrage Association, after all these suffragists came together into one big group, they actually rescinded her membership in 1898, and they returned her dues to her. And they said, you can't come to meetings anymore. You know, you will not be recognized as a speaker. You won't be given time on the floor, nothing. Okay. So she was pushed out of the movement, and as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were putting together a formal written history of the women's suffrage movement, guess whose name does not appear? She was literally written out, and it was a conscious effort by these women who just said, this is not the type of woman we want representing our movement. So, again, just to kind of reinforce that outsider status and kind of reinforcing what I said, that people knew her name for decades. She was lampooned also in magazine and newspaper articles. This magazine from the mid-1880s, the person sitting on the chair there identified as Dr. Mary Walker. And for a time, trousers were sometimes referred to as Mary Walkers, especially if a woman happened to be wearing them. Oh, she's wearing her Mary Walkers today. And here you can see in her last decade of life that, again, her clothing undergoes an even more tailored change. And it does very much look like what we would consider to be men's evening wear. Because she's wearing a long overcoat, you can't really see it, but she did have the longer tails. And she had that top hat that she wore quite a bit. And she was a very familiar figure, still in Washington, D.C., both in terms of, she wasn't practicing medicine too much, but, you know, consulting. She was doing work on behalf of veterans at the nation's capital. She was a big proponent of veterans receiving their benefits. She helped a lot of them with that after the war. She was on Capitol Hill a lot during the 1910s. And when that final push came for suffrage, this, of course, coincided with the First World War. And in 1914, Dr. Mary Walker had planned to join up with the Red Cross. She, again, wanted to donate her medical expertise, even though she really hadn't been practicing very much, but she had full intentions of being part of this war effort. She actually didn't care for the direction of the suffrage movement in this last phase. Some of you may be familiar with the silent Sentinels, the women who stood outside the Wilson White House, calling his attention to the suffrage campaign and calling him to account. Mary Walker did not approve. She thought these young women were just publicity seekers. She thought they didn't understand about the new departures. They didn't understand that the Constitution already provided for suffrage, so why are they agitating for this amendment? She was very critical of these women. She was also very ill at this point. In 1917, on one of her, I think it was her last trip to Washington, D.C., she was on the steps of the Capitol building. She claimed that a large gust of wind blew her over. She was kind of a small person. She may have tripped and fallen, and at her age, she was in her 80s at this point, she did make it home to Oswego, and she was essentially bedridden for the last 2 years of her life. And she was competent, though, enough to know that in 1917, her Medal of Honor was rescinded. Now, it's really easy for us to all of a sudden just leap to this assumption that, oh, she was stripped of this medal because she was a woman, and the Army finally just decided we can't have any of this. But that wasn't true. The United States Army went through a review of all Medal of Honor holders not long after World War I started, because they knew there were going to be more of them. It's just a reality of warfare. And also, Congress had then stipulated that Medal of Honor winners were entitled to a monthly stipend after their service. So they were very careful about who was really entitled to have that medal. And Mary Walker was actually one of over 900 people who were stripped of their medals. Now, it was also not a case where the Army demanded that she send her medal back. The Army did request that these recipients then return their medals to the government, but Mary Walker, being Mary Walker, said, "Oh no," and she was, when she was buried, she was wearing her medal, so she refused to give it back. She never recognized. She said, "Well, you know, President Johnson gave me this medal, and he's the only one who could take it away." She did not recognize the authority even of the Army Board to do this to her. So even though it was officially rescinded in 1917, she didn't give it up. And she was vindicated, because not long after her death in 1919, people started agitating for a return of that medal. And these people came from various walks of life. Some were her relatives, some were just, you know, people who were interested in her and her career. And it took a very long time, though, in 1977. And I just want to make a couple of points about why in 1977, out of all, you know, out of decades of trouble over this, why would it happen in 1977? Any ideas? I know I'm calling on everybody to think too far back. But I think it was a convergence of two kind of unusual things. One is that the United States in the 1970s was full of bicentennial spirit. And I mean, we've all lived through it, right? I remember it, and it was big. It wasn't just in 1976. It started earlier than that and carried through. So there was this great patriotic momentum in the 70s that converged with a very vital and active second wave of feminism. So there were a lot of women who looked back at what happened to Mary Walker and did very much see it in gendered terms. And so they put pressure, and Congress was actually beginning to take action on this, but they were beaten to it by an actual Army board that was convening to review some of these earlier rescissions. And it was the Army Board itself then that reversed its earlier decision in 1977 and reinstated the award. And oftentimes you will see, if you read like Wikipedia or something, it'll say, well, Jimmy Carter returned her medal to her. Well, he was the president at the time, but it actually was all done through the Army, which she would have found entirely appropriate. Not that she ever believed she lost it in the first place, but to her it would have been an Army matter. Right. So in the end then, what was Dr. Mary Walker's legacy? Well, certainly women's suffrage. She did put a lot of time and effort, her own money spent traveling around under, you know, and I've got some pretty interesting stories too about that lecture circuit that she was on for promoting women's suffrage, often facing hostile audiences. But she just, for the rest of her life, women's rights, gender equality, women's suffrage. So that's one legacy. The other legacy, this of course is Katharine Hepburn in a very stylish pair of trousers. And I think too that Mary Walker's insistence on a woman being able to choose her style of dress was something that did eventually catch on. And even in the early part of the 1900s, when you think of, say, the Gibson girl, even at the turn of the century, and certainly by the 1920s, well, flappers were all about the short skirts, but the physical education, the outdoor sports that more and more women were getting involved in, so she was kind of vindicated with that too, that you tailor that to your activities and to your own wishes. So I think certainly dress reform is one of her legacies. And finally, women in the military. I think that Mary Walker would actually be appalled to find that she still is the only woman to have received the Medal of Honor, because I think she would expect that other women are like her and would want to do the same kinds of things. And so I think, though, that she would be very happy to know that there are virtually no barriers left to women in the military. They can join up any branch, and now we know they're being trained for combat, that those final barriers have come down as well. And I know that there have been some women now who are being considered for that Medal of Honor. It still hasn't actually gone through, but there has at least been some discussion of that more recently. That, I think, is what would also make Dr. Mary Walker very happy. So that's the end. So we have time for questions then.
Thank you, Theresa. Just want to remind everybody in the audience to please use a microphone if you've got a question for her. And Vanel can come around with the portable mic. And I want to repeat for people who are watching at home, the phone number for a phoned-in question is 715-942-9917. So raise your hand.
Yes, hi. I grew up in New York State, at least to mid high school years, so I've had all my New York civics and things. We all learn about Seneca Falls and the great suffrage movement, and it always seems to be New York-centric. Do you know why Wyoming was the first to go ahead and approve suffrage for women?
Yeah, this is always one of the interesting things, and this was something that suffrage advocates were also kind of startled with their progress in the Western territories and then in the Western states, that after all of this hard fighting on the East Coast, you would think that especially a state like New York would have been the first to go, but New York was, I think, one of the last, actually. And historians have looked at it from different angles, but I think what it came down to was this actually was a good enticement method for settlement. That in the desire to have white settlers in the West, and to make sure that this was done according to family formations to get the kinds of stable towns, you needed to have women in these areas. And what a lot of these local politicians then realized was, well, one of the things that might entice them, what is it that they can't get elsewhere, but that they could get here? And it was the vote. So, it sounds astounding to us now that might be a big draw, but for some, and this is, we also don't then see tens of thousands of women rushing west just so they can vote. But it was kind of a nice boost. And then it kind of works the other way for the suffrage movement, because a lot of people who were still anti-suffrage, they would say things, well, yeah, so what, Wyoming, who cares what they do out in Wyoming? So they could write it off that way. Whereas if it had been New York, then how do you write off a state like New York giving women voting rights? But also, I should point out, it's not that until 1920 no women voted. Okay? Even if they didn't live in states that granted full suffrage, there were plenty of states that granted partial suffrage. So, for example, one of the ways women could vote that was considered to be, gender appropriate was for school board elections. Because to a lot of small towns this made sense. Women were the first educators of their children. A lot of women went on to be school teachers, so they did have this sort of natural interest in educational matters, so let them vote in school board things.
In the beginning of the Civil War, when Mary was working for free, how did she live? I mean, did people take her in and feed her, or did she get money from home?
Yeah, I think, and this was kind of hard to trace, because she she didn't leave. She was not a prolific writer. She did some public writings, like she wrote for a dress reform journal. She did write some articles, but like she didn't keep a journal. Not many of her letters have survived, so I don't know the exact money situation. But I think she saw enough private patients. I think some people just did like give her money, like grateful family members even, who, if she was tending the soldiers, and so family members would come to Washington to visit their wounded and sick soldiers, and sometimes they gave her some money. And she did realize the problem of accommodation. She did rent a room. She had a place, like an apartment, to live. But one of her projects, I think starting in about 1863, was she created a fund for single women coming into Washington, because this was a huge public no-no. You're not a single woman on your own in a big city without family connections. But of course the war upends all of this, right? Because you have wives and mothers coming into Washington looking for their men, and they don't know anybody else in the city. They need to have a place to stay. Yet the automatic assumption is, if you're a woman alone on the streets of a city, you're a prostitute. So Mary Walker actually started this charity for women so that they would have a place to stay when they came to Washington that was respectable. So I think she was basically living off of handouts and family money. And sometimes she would go home. Even during the war, there were times when she would go back to Oswego for a few weeks, maybe even a couple of months, and then she would go on to her next self-posting, because she was basically sending herself around until she got that contract in 1864. So yeah, when you think of that commitment and understand that she was volunteering her services, she had no salary to fall back on until 1864.
And then, did she serve any Confederate civilians when she was in Georgia?
She did. When I was talking about when she was moving out away from that encampment where the Ohio Regiment was, that was all in service of civilians. And she didn't really ask their political affiliations. I mean, she was assuming, because this was Georgia, that they were all Confederates, and some were more blatant than others about their political loyalties. And there was one time where she was called out to take care of a sick child in this household, and she knew that the husband and the father was a Confederate soldier, and he actually came home while she was still there. And when she was under contract as a surgeon, because she was a civilian, of course she didn't have an Army uniform, but again, being Mary Walker, she liked the symbolism. So she made herself an outfit that looked very much like a United States Army officer's medical uniform. But of course she had the long dress over the trousers, but she wore a sash that was the surgeon's colors. So you would be hard pressed to figure out, was she civilian or was she military? And so this guy comes home at night and he sees her in his house, and he realizes that she's a Yankee doctor and suspects that she's also, associated with the Army. But he says, well, lucky for you, I'm technically on leave, so I'm not, you're welcome in my home. I'm not going to do anything. And I guess the big thing she was worried about really was her horse, that he was going to steal her horse. And he didn't. So, and these kinds of things, they're fluid in wartime. And she was not sympathetic to Confederate civilians, though. I mean, she willingly treated them as patients, but she there was no talking to her about any legitimacy for secession or anything like that. She drew the line there. She had no sympathy for that. And after her time at Castle Thunder, when she was working in a prison, a women's prison, and these were Confederate women who were arrested for a variety of charges. And I think this was when she was in Kentucky. She did not like those women. She had to treat them as a doctor, but that's as far as her sympathy took her, because she knew very well what they were capable of doing and interfering with union efforts. So yeah, she had no sympathy for them.
Quiet audience tonight. Well, you did a great job covering the subject, and I look
thank
forward
you.
to reading the book.
And speaking of that, I did say there was a free copy. So what we did was we taped a piece of paper under a chair. So if you look under your chair or under the chair of, if you've got an empty chair next to you, somebody's going to find a piece of paper that says book winner on it.
Mine's just made in China.
So
We have a winner.
there you go. Congratulations. Oh, you're very welcome. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Theresa.
I didn't want to ask them.